Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Good day to all of you. My name is Steven J. Pasandalan, the group leader of this group from Bachelor of Arts in Islamic Studies 1B. Before I will start, I would like to introduce to all of you my co-members, which is Juhaira Angas and Jubaina Lagyoma, and we are the group Steven. First, I will discuss the topic, and it's all about the principles of communications. So what is all about principles of communications? The principles of communication make provision of knowledge and understanding among the individuals in terms of communication skills that are needed to live one's live well and achieve the desired goals and objectives. Why principles of communication is important? By following the clarity principle of communication, one can focus on specific message at a time. So the message that is being conveyed must be clear. It also helps receiver to easily understand the given message or idea. Due to clarity, there is much appropriate and exact message transmission. Next is the principles about nature of communications. So what is all about nature of communications? The nature of communications, the exchange of information between two people. It is required that there be both a sender and receiver for communication to take place. Communications is reciprocal, so at any time the sender is sending a message, the receiver is also sending a message. Nature of communications has a symbolic nature and is an act of sharing one's ideas, emotions, attitudes, or perceptions with another person or group of persons through words, written or spoken, gestures, signals, signs, or another modes of transmitting image. Next is the following principles of communications make it more effective. Number 1. Principles of clarity. The idea or message to be communicated should be spelled out. It should be worded in such a way that the receiver understands the same thing which the sender wants to convey. There should be no ambiguity in the message. It should be keep in mind that the words do not speak themselves, but the speaker gives them to the meaning. So, how clarity is important in effective communication? Whether it might be at a workplace or among a group of friends, clarity is most crucial element to ensure effective communication. Without clarity, there are more chances that you may be misunderstood. Having clarity in communication eliminates all possibilities of communications and miscommunication. Number 2. Principles of attentions. In order to make communication effective, the receiver's attention shall be drawn towards the message. People are different in behavior, attentions, emotion, and etc. So they may respond differently to the message.
So why principle of attention is important in a communication? Principle of attention communication requires that the reviewer of message shall be understand the message. It is possible only when the recipient pays attention to the message being communicated. For this, manager shall be aroused the interest of the receiver so that the receiver pays proper attention.
Number 3. Principle of feedback. The principle of feedback is very important to make the communication effective. There should be feedback information from the recipient to know whether he has understood the message in the same sense in which the sender has meant.
Feedback shall be clearly stated, specific, and based on what is observed, both the action and the impact of the action. Feedback should be descriptive, not evaluative. Feedback is not about personal judgment, but based on observed behavior and actions. Feedback shall be referred behavior that can be changed. So next one, principle of informality. Formal communication is generally used for transmitting message and other information. Sometimes formal communication may not achieve the desired results. Informal communication may prove effective in such a situation. Management shall be used informal communication for assessing the reaction of employees towards various policies. Senior management may informally convey certain decisions to the employees for getting their feedback. So this principle states that informal communication is as important as formal communication. So next one is principle of consistency. This principle states that communication should always be consistent with the policies, plans, programs, and objectives of the organization, not in conflict with them. If the message and communications are in conflict with the policies and programs, then there will be confusion in the minds of urbanites and they may not implement with them properly. Such a situation will be detrimental to the interest of organization. So next one is principle of timeliness. This principle states that the communication shall be done at proper time so that it helps in implementing plans. Any delay in communication may not serve any purpose, rather decisions become of historical importance only. So what are the importance of a timeliness in communication? So it affords them to needed time to plan and analyze the information. Timely communication can therefore be said to help organization make the most of every opportunity through informed decision making. The last is principle of adequacy. The information communicated should be adequate and complete in all aspects. Adequate information may delay action and create confusion. Inadequate information also affect efficiency of the receiver. So adequate information is essential for taking proper decisions and making action plan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Juhaira A. Angas from Group Steven, Principles of Communication, Actu Bernales, Balion, and Biligan 2018. These are what I will discuss about the principles of communication. 1. Communication is an interaction situation wherein the participants are affected by each one's behavior. Every message is simultaneously a stimulus to new behavior and a response to prior behavior of the receiver. No message should be isolated from what has occurred before between the communicants if we really want to understand the message. It should be understood in the totality of the situation. Communication involves giving or receiving a message to another individual with the conscious intent of eliciting and evoking a response. Communication refers to all behavior, both verbal and nonverbal, which occur in a social context. The message involves those verbal and nonverbal behaviors are behavioral stimulus enacted by communicators that are interpreted with meaning by others. The verbal portion of the message refers to the words that we speak, while the nonverbal portion includes our tone of voice, the way we stand, the way we look at another, and other non-vocal components such as personal appearance, postures, eye behavior, gestures, and body movements. 2. One does communicate. We do communicate even when we are ignoring the message of another or maintaining complete silence. An easy way to understand this would be to think, what would you do if someone you did not want to interact with passed a smile to you? Even by ignoring him, you would still be communicating. I do not want to relate to you. Silence. Postures and all nonverbal behaviors are the ways we communicate even when we wish to deny doing so. One piece of communication that accompanies our nonverbal reactions is silence. We can convey approval, disapproval, anger, or other message through a silence response. Silence generally means the absence of any kind of noise, but in communication, it is seen as an absence of speech. So the absence of speech doesn't mean that the person is not communicating with the other person. 3. The message received is not necessarily the message sent. We usually relate to others as if there was only one reality. The way we perceive the world, we are alive as separate individuals with different experiences and different views of reality. How we interpret verbal and nonverbal messages may be quite different from the meaning intended by the speaker or the communicator. Even when several people are viewing the same behavior, each interprets it differently. While talking or writing, we are describing only those experiences that occur inside us, and they may not be the same for others because every person, because of his different background, is unique. The message sent may not be the message received because it must pass through a filtering system or thoughts and feelings for both the sender and the receiver. 4. Communication occurs simultaneously at more than one level. We communicate on the level of the literal content of the information being conveyed as well as on the relationship level. In other words, we do not convey information to the receiver verbally only, by the context in which the communication occurs, and by various verbal and nonverbal cues. We are also telling the other person how we see our relationship with him, how we see ourselves, and how we should interpret our messages. Speakers use nonverbal cues all the time through body language or tone, but they might also deliver cues verbally. A verbal cue is a prompt that is conveyed in a spoken language from one person to another or a group of people. This second level of communication is called meta-communication and refers to any communication about communication or any verbal or nonverbal cues about the literal content of the message sent. For example, I may say to another person, "I am very happy with you," and be serious, indicating that I do not mean what I say. I may also verbally meta-communicate by adding, "I was only joking," which tells the receiver how he should interpret my original statement. The context in which communication occurs is another important component of meta-communication. If I slap my wife while traveling in the bus, I would be telling the word something quite different than if I were to do the same thing in my own house. Metacommunication is a secondary communication, including indirect cues, about how a piece of information is meant to be interpreted. It is based on the idea that the same message accompanied by different metacommunication can mean something entirely different, including its opposite, as in irony. Metacommunication is essential for improving communication capability both for individual and teams. It helps us to stand back and observe our meetings, calls, emails, presentation, etc., thereby learning more from success and failures.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Jubaina A. Lugyama. I'm the grade reporter of Group 7. For basic principle of interpersonal communication, we have four types of interpersonal communication. First is interpersonal communication is inescapable. We cannot not communicate. The very attempt not to communicate communicates something through not only words, but through tone of voice and through gesture, posture, facial expression, etc. We constantly communicate to those around us. Through these channels, we constantly receive communication from others. Even when you sleep, you communicate. Remember, a basic principle of communication in general. People are not mind readers. Another way to put this is, people judge you by your behavior, not your intent. So, dito sa principle na to, hindi tayo magkipag-communication, verbal man sa salita, sa galaw, sa facial expression, sa posture, nakikipag-communication tayo sa lahat ng tao nasa paligid natin. At ganun din sila sa atin. Nakikipag-communicate din ang ibang tao na nakapaligid sa atin. Kahit natulog tayo, nagkakaroon pa rin tayo ng communication. Remember, a basic principle of communication in general. Ang mga tao ay hindi nagbabasa ng nasa isip natin, but rather, nakikipag-communicate sila. Tinatanong tayo kung ano ba iniisip natin. Doon na po-form ang salitang communication. Nagkakaroon ng communication sa pamagitan nun. So, ang mga tao, i-judge ka kung paano ka nag-act, kung ano yung gesture mo, facial expression mo, yun ang nakikita nila, hindi yung attention mo. Sa pamamagitan nun, nagkakaroon ng communication at hindi ito basta-basta lang mawala kahit saan ka man meron communication na naganap sa'yo sa mga taong nakapaligid sa'yo. The second principle of interpersonal communication is irreversible. You can't really take back something once it has been said. The effect must inevitably remain, despite the instruction from a judge to a jury to disregard that last statement that witness made. The lawyer knows that it can help but make an impression to the jury. A Russian proverb said, "Once a word goes out of your mouth, you can never swallow it again." So, sa second principle of interpersonal communication is irreversible. Ang ibig sabihin naman nito ay irreversible. Ang ibig sabihin naman ng irreversible ay ano yung nasabi o nagawa mo na nakapag-communicate sa ibang tao na di mo na mababawi. Kung ano yung nasabi mo, for example, kung ano yung nasabi mo, hindi mo na ito basta-basta mababawi pa. Or kung ano yung act na pinapakita mo, or kung ano yung communication sa ginagawa mo sa pamagitan ng action or facial expression, ay hindi mo na ito mababawi. Ang magiging epekto ng way na ipinakita mo o yung epekto ng sinabi mo ay hindi ito basta-basta matatanggal or mananatili ito. So, a Russian proverb say, "Once a word comes out of your mouth, you can never swallow it again." So, meron proverbs ang Russian na kapag lumabas to ang salita mula sa iyong bibig, ay hindi mo ito malulunok ulit. So, yun na po yung second principle of interpersonal communication is irreversible. The third of basic principle interpersonal communication is complicated. No form of communication is simple. Because of the number of variables involved, even simple requests are extremely complex. Theorists note that whenever we communicate, there are really at least 6 people involved. So number 1, who you think you are. Number 2, who you think the other person is. Number 3, who you think the other person thinks you are. Number 4, who the other person thinks she is. Number 5, who the other person thinks you are. And number 6, who the other person thinks you think he is. We don't actually swap ideas. We swap symbols that stand for ideas. This also complicates communication. Word symbols do not have inherent meaning. We simply use them in certain ways, and no two people use the same words exactly alike. Osmo Bio give us some communication maxim similar to Murphy law, Osmo Vios laws, and some others. Expo Finland Wellen Goes 1978. So, sa interpersonal communication is complicated. So, lahat ng form ng communication ay di madali dahil meron tayong sa bawat communication na nagaganap, meron tayong iba't ibang bagay na kailangan consider, and kapag tayo ang nakikipag-communicate, hindi tayo basta-basta nakikipagbigayan lang ng ideas kung ano yung magiging impact nito sa sarili natin, sa ibang tao at sa iba pang tao. At kapag tayo ang nakikipag-usap, hindi tayo basta-basta lang gumagamit ng mga paraan kung saan pareho kayo ng kausap mo ng ideas, kaya naging komplikado siya. Dahil may mga bagay na konsidera kapag tayo ay nakikipag-communicate sa ibang tao. Isipin natin kung sino ba tayo para sabihin ito. Sino ba siya para sabihin ko ito. Example lang yun, sa interpersonal communication is complicated. So marami kang kailangan konsidera kapag ikaw ay interact o nang nakikipag-usap sa mga tao lang sa nakapaligid sa'yo. If communication can fail, it will. So meron ditong similar sa principle na ito, at itong laman na ito ay naglalaman kapag ang communication ay nag-fail, ay mag-fail talaga. If a message can be understood in different ways, it will be understood in just that way which does the most harm. Kapag naman ang mensahe ay naintindihan sa iba't ibang paraan, ay maaaring maintindihan ito sa mas komplikadong pamamaraan, sa mas komplikadong mensahe. There is always somebody who knows better than you what you mean by your message. At meron ibang tao na mas nakakaalam kung ano ibig sabihin ng iyong sinasabi. The more communication there is, the more difficult it is for communication to succeed. So kung mas maraming communication ang meron sa pag-uusap na yon, ay mas lalo siyang naging mahirap na maintindihan o maging succeed yung communication. So, itong mga nandito, hindi ito totoong principle. Nire-remind lang tayo nito sa kung paano maging mahirap o magiging tama na mag-accurate sa isang communication. The last part is interpersonal communication is contextual. In other words, communication does not happen in isolation. There is psychological context, which is who you are and what you bring to the interaction, your needs, desires, values, personality, etc. All form the psychological context. You here refers to both participants in the interaction. So kapag nakikipag-communicate tayo, ay meron pagkakaunawa na magaganap. Hindi ito pwedeng isang side lang. So meron tayong psychological context. Ang psychological context na ito ay dito pumapasok yung ikaw at kung paano ka nagdadala o nagpapakita ng interaction sa iyong kausap, maging sa pangangailangan, sa desires, values, o personality. Or dapat kapag nakikipag-usap ka ng interaction, mayroong relation, dapat nakaka-relate yung kausap mo, naintindihan niya. You're exchanging ideas of something where can you relate both. So relational context, which concern your reaction to the other person, the mix. Sa relational context, ang concern naman ay yung reaction sa ibang person. So, kailangan pag nag-react ka sa ibang tao, kailangan relate dun sa kanyang sinabi or kanyang ibinalita. Situational context deals with the psychosocial where you are communicating. An interaction that takes place in a classroom will be very different from one that takes place in a bar. So, sa situational context ay nakikipag-communicate ka dito na sang-ayon o nasaan ka. Halimbawa kung ikaw ay nasa eskwelahan, nakikipag-interaction ka between you and your teacher at classmates. Kung saan relate kayo sa inyong pinag-uusapan. Example, sa lesson. At iba naman kapag ikaw ay nasa bahay niyo, nakikipag-interaction ka sa mga kapatid, nanay at tatay mo sa mga bagay na related o nagkakaintindihan kayo. Environmental context deals with the physical where you are communicating, furniture, location, noise level, temperature, season, time of day, all are example of factor in the environmental context. Sa environmental context, is nagmamatter siya, nakafocus siya kung nasaan ka physically nakikipag-communicate. For example, kung ikaw ay nasa ibang location, nakikipag-communicate ka ng malakas sa iyong kausap dahil meron doon sa noise level sa place kung saan ka. So, environmental context, isa dito yung noise level kapag masyado na maingay. Ang tinutukoy dito ay pareho kayong relate sa lugar or environment na meron kayo. Isa yon sa mga factor na meron ang environmental context. Cultural context includes all the learned behavior and rules that affect the interaction. If you come from a culture, foreign or within your own country, where it's considered rude to make a long, direct eye contact, you will out of politeness avoid eye contact. If the other person comes from a culture where long, direct eye contact signals trustworthiness, then we have in the cultural context a basis for misunderstanding. Sa cultural context naman ay nagpapabilang dito yung behavior or rules na pwede maka-epekto dito sa interaction ng dalawang taong nag-uusap o marami. So kung papasok dito ang mga action sa mga rules na nakapag-epekto sa mga interaction. Cultural context ay kapag yung kausap mo ay hindi na pag-aralan o hindi mo alam ang kanyang behavior or rules, culturally ay maaaring magkaroon ng misunderstanding sa kahit anong pamamaraan ng pagkikipag-communication. So, isa yon sa mga consider dito sa cultural context.